Hello, awesome students. This is Mr. Laubach. I hope this video finds you well. In this video, we are going to go over some of the key parts of American imperialism. As far as a time period is concerned, we are looking at the very late 19th century and the first couple of decades of the 20th century. We will go over the following items: big stick diplomacy, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the negotiating of and the building of the Panama Canal. We will conclude with a quick overview of the foreign policies of Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. So here we go. In 1901, only a few months after being inaugurated president for the second time, President McKinley was fatally shot by an anarchist. McKinley's vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, quickly took over. Teddy Roosevelt was a young expansionist and hero of the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt described his foreign policy as speak softly and carry a big stick. This quickly became labeled big stick diplomacy, and it had a very aggressive connotation. Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far, was a favorite African proverb of Teddy Roosevelt. Big stick diplomacy had five main components. First, it was essential to possess serious military capability that would force the adversary to pay close attention. That meant a world-class navy. It should be noted that Roosevelt never had a large army at his disposal, but had a very powerful navy. TR stated that he believed the U.S. should act justly and fairly towards other nations all of the time. Now, of course, his actions regarding this were debatable. Number 3, never bluff. If you say you are going to do something, you must do it, according to Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. Number 4, to strike only when prepared and to strike very hard when you do. Number 5, and lastly, he believed that the U.S. had to be willing to allow the adversary to save face in defeat and back out if necessary. President Roosevelt's assertive big stick approach was used especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. The Caribbean was often referred to as Yankee Lake because the United States was so influential and involved in the region. This policy became known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. First, let's review. The Monroe Doctrine was installed by President James Monroe during the era of good feelings, and it stated that all European powers are supposed to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. And in return, the United States would stay out of European affairs. So what exactly was the Roosevelt corollary? The United States would be able to set up colonies in Latin America. The United States would negotiate disputes between European countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The U.S. would basically act as the police officer of the Western Hemisphere. In other words, if you were a European power and you had an issue with a country in the Western Hemisphere, you should come to the United States first. Many Latin American countries were in deep financial trouble with European countries and could not pay them back. As an example, in 1902, the British dispatched warships to Venezuela to force them to pay their debt. A similar thing happened in the modern-day Dominican Republic. Roosevelt saw this as a blatant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. He insisted that the United States would intervene instead. The U.S. sent warships to the region, and the Marines occupied Santo Domingo's major ports to manage the collection of customs and taxes until the debts were satisfied. Over the next 2 decades, U.S. presidents would use the Roosevelt corollary to justify sending U.S. forces into Haiti, Honduras, the Dominican Republic again, and Nicaragua. A long-term effect of this policy was that the U.S. relations with Latin America were not very good. By acting boldly and decisively in a number of situations, Roosevelt attempted to build the reputation of the United States as a world power. This was the essence of big stick diplomacy. American imperials applauded every one of Roosevelt's moves, but critics didn't like how the U.S. was changing its non-involvement, neutrality stance it had observed for over a century. Now for the Panama Canal. As a result of the Spanish-American War, the new American empire stretched from Puerto Rico in the Caribbean to the Philippines in the Pacific. As a strategic necessity for holding on to these far-flung islands, the U.S. desired a canal through Central America to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The canal could reduce a 12,000-mile voyage from the East Coast to San Francisco to a 5,000-mile voyage, as you can see on this map. However, building a canal would be difficult, both politically and structurally. The French had already failed to complete a canal earlier through Central America. The Hay-Ponce-Forte Treaty was signed in 1901, where the British allowed the United States to build a canal in the region alone. Roosevelt was eager to begin construction of the canal through the narrow, rugged terrain of the Isthmus of Panama. He was very frustrated, however, by Colombia's control of this strip of land, and it refused to agree to U.S. terms for digging the canal through that territory. Losing patience with Colombia's demand of more money and sovereignty over the canal, Roosevelt orchestrated a revolt for Panama's independence in 1903. With the support of the U.S. Navy, the rebellion succeeded immediately and almost without any bloodshed. However, the new government of independent Panama had to sign the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty of 1903. This treaty gave the United States control over the 51-mile-long and 10-mile-wide canal zone in which it promised to protect. The building of the canal began in 1904 and was completed in 1914. Amazing that such an endeavor only took 10 years. A workforce of about 30,000 laborers worked on what became known as the Big Ditch. The construction included many dangerous and difficult conditions. Hundreds of laborers lost their lives in the effort. Heat, humidity, mosquitoes, and yellow fever ran rampant throughout the whole process. The project cost $375 million. That would have been $9 billion in today's money. Most Americans approved of Roosevelt's determination to build a canal, but many were unhappy with his strong-handed tactics to secure the canal zone. The construction of the Panama Canal made the security of the Caribbean a vital American interest. Latin Americans were especially resentful. To compensate, Congress finally voted later in 1921 to pay Colombia an indemnity of $25 million for the loss of Panama. This is a famous picture of the SS Ancon, which was the first ship to go through the Panama Canal after it was officially opened. There was a ship that went through the Panama Canal before it was completed, but this picture ended up being sent around the world to commemorate the big achievement of the Panama Canal. In 1999, the United States returned the canal zone to the Republic of Panama to end the growing bitterness over the original treaty. Today, the canal operates 24 hours a day, 365 days per year. Managing the canal requires efforts of around 10,000 workers. Traveling the canal between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean takes about 8 to 10 hours nowadays, which first started out as an idea from Teddy Roosevelt, ended up becoming one of the most important waterways in the world. To finish off the video, we are going to quickly go over the foreign policies of the Imperial presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, which you can see pictured here. They also happen to be considered the Progressive era presidents as well, but we will focus on them as Imperial presidents. As a review from earlier in the video, Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy was called Big Stick Diplomacy. The objective was to keep Europe out of Latin America, and the Roosevelt corollaries was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. And the idea was to use force when necessary, but diplomacy first. Again, Roosevelt saw the United States as the police officer of the Western Hemisphere. Teddy Roosevelt, with his Big Stick Diplomacy, wanted to project American power. William Howard Taft believed in dollar diplomacy. Taft pushed for dollars as bullets, as he referred to it. Taft focused on the United States investing heavily in the Caribbean and Central America, and he believed the best way to help them out was to invest and make them economic viable countries. And of course, this would benefit the United States. Americans began investing in oil wells, railways, mines, and plantations. Instead of just focusing on projecting power like Teddy Roosevelt, Taft wanted to protect American business interests in Latin America and the Caribbean as a priority. This is a pretty famous political cartoon. This is Taft here, who was a bigger gentleman. President Taft's dollar diplomacy with Teddy's big stick. So he says, go invest in Latin America with the full faith of the U.S. government and its military. And you can see there U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, AT&T, and U.S. Rubber. And of course, Taft is winking, saying that he will protect their interests, of course. Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy was called Big Stick Diplomacy. Taft's was called dollar diplomacy. Woodrow Wilson's was referred to as moral diplomacy. The objective of moral diplomacy was to support democratic governments in Latin America and the Caribbean and oppose oppressive, undemocratic governments. Remember, Wilson was the only Democrat of this group, while Taft and Roosevelt, of course, were Republicans. During the 1912 election, Wilson was very critical of Roosevelt and Taft's policies. He then brought up the idea of this moral diplomacy, which focused on promoting human rights and integrity and opportunity rather than to seek territory conquest and to show great power or to make it just an economic endeavor. Woodrow Wilson believed that democracy was the most important thing and ultimately would make these nations allies and useful resources since the U.S. would support their endeavor to become democratic countries. As a matter of fact, in entering World War I, Woodrow Wilson famously said that the United States is going to make the world safe for democracy.